Ben Wicks, welcome to Australian Musician.
Welcome, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ben, why the bass?
Curtis Mayfield is the answer to that. It's not where I started, but it's definitely where I finished. There's something about low end that's just magical, you know. The nuance, and I was actually having a conversation just recently with a session guy from the States about bottom end and low end and bass playing, and we kind of came to the realization or the point that anything that's easy to do is impossible to master. And I think that says a lot about the bass as an instrument. You know, it's easy to pick it up and make a sound, but to really get into the zen and the mastery of it is a whole other thing.
What was your first bass?
My dad lay-byed me a DeVille P-bass knockoff on Chapel Street in the late 90s. Yeah, and that was, I think I've still got that somewhere, you know, the bottom of a cupboard, but yeah, that was the beginning of the end. Here I am 20 whatever years later, still playing, love it.
We're filming today at GH Music in Flemington.
Yeah.
Was there a store that you frequented growing up?
Well, I moved around a lot, so not so much because of that moving around, but I finished high school in Footscray, which was kind of close to here on public transport. So we actually did spend a lot of time here in sort of, you know, those kind of pivotal years when you're deciding whether you're actually going to take this music thing seriously or not. I actually bought at one of those flash sales they used to do here. I bought my first Gallion Kruger proper amplifier. It was like my first real amp here. That's got to be 2000 maybe, so like 20 years ago. Yeah. Did spend a bit of time in here. It was great.
Do you enjoy just calling into music stores in general and just having a look?
I do. I think that the music store, as much as, you know, we all think, all musicians and all professional players think they know exactly what they like. And we spend hours on YouTube and hours looking at demo videos and all that stuff. It's not until you can pick an instrument up and really, you know, or play through an amplifier that you really get a sense for what it's about. And so for me, spending time in music stores and being a part of a community that grows around a music store is really important. You know, there's something really magical about being able to walk into a store where someone knows you and knows the gear you like and then you can have that conversation about what's new, what's Fender done, like not what's the Fender spiel, but what has Fender actually done this year in the new P-bass, what's different about it, and be able to pick one up and play it and really get a feel for it. Like and we're going to lose that, you know, if we lose all of the music stores, you know, and that'll be a real shame.
When you did start getting into bass, you mentioned Curtis Mayfield and his records.
Yeah.
Who were the bass players that you really got into?
You know, the Blues Brothers film obviously was a big impact, had a big impact on me, which is, you know, Donald McDonoug's all over that, and I still go back and look at his stuff now and still pick little gems out of what he does and his note selection and stuff. But then, you know, all of the Motown guys, and then, you know, so Bob Babbitt and James Jamerson, and it just, you know, that old school kind of vibe. But but growing up when I did in the 90s, and everything came through this sort of grunge filter. So everything came through, like Chris Novoselic from Nirvana and Mike Dirnt from Green Day, and those two guys, like, as much as grunge music and punk music is this like obnoxious kind of thing, both those guys had a really, really good grasp of melody and a really good grasp of sonically what they were doing. And so, yeah, you go back and look at a lot of their lines, and there's some really interesting stuff in there too. So yes, the blues stuff as an overview, but, you know, everyone is always learning through that first, you know, the first lesson you learn dictates the way you take the next lesson, which dictates the way you take the next lesson. So it's impossible for me to talk about bass playing influences without touching on those sort of early grunge people on my playing.
You played with a lot of people through the years. Tell us about some of the people you played with and who have been mentors to you.
Mentors, well, I guess, you know, Lloyd Spiegel has been a huge impact, had a huge impact on me, and not only in the way that I play, but in the way that I interact with the younger generation coming up, because of the way he interacted with me. I was very lucky to play with Dutch a couple of times, Dutch Tilders. You know, I was very lucky to spend a little bit of time with Chris Wilson. You know, they were amazing men, incredible musicians, but real thinkers. Real, you know, like the concept of an elder statesman is, you know, really there when I think about Chris and Dutch.
The relationship between a bass player and a drummer is very special. You're the rhythm section. What kind of drummers do you like to play with?
That's a tricky question, because I'm going to insult half the drummers in Melbourne by answering it. But it depends on the gig, you know. And as a bass player, the answer to that question is a drummer that's listening, not only to what I'm doing, but to what the song's doing. A drummer that's dynamic, but that comes from listening. And someone who's not super interested in being flashy, someone who's just, you know, listening to what's going on around them and playing the song. But the answer to that question, as someone who books gigs and promotes gigs and runs bands, is someone that's going to learn the material, turn up, and not cause any more stress than is necessary. And in a lot of cases, when it comes down to booking a player for a run of gigs or booking a player for a certain show, their ability to not stress me out or anyone else around them out, 9 times out of 10 is more important than their ability to play the material flawlessly. So yes, there's 2 answers to that question.
Let's talk about your project, which has been close to your heart for a little while now, which is Blues Roulette.
Yeah.
Firstly, can you describe what it is?
Well, Blues Roulette is essentially a rhythm section, or like a house band. It started as that. Me and a drummer, Scotty Bennett, was the initial drummer that did those shows with me in Fitzroy at the Catfish. And basically, we turn up every Wednesday with a different singer, different, you know, whether they're a guitar player or a keys player or whatever, and we play a couple of sets. There's no rehearsals, there's no chord charts, there's no none of the annoying bits and pieces that musicians avoid at the best of times, and all of the fun bit, which is actually playing music. I think that we've lost some part of playing music. The second it becomes a professional thing. The second it becomes, I need to sell a product, you kind of squeeze all of the playing and all of the fun out and replace it with a photocopy of exactly what you put on the CD, so that there's a better chance that you'll sell the CD because people are going to recognize it or something, which I think is really counterintuitive, because the second you're having fun and you're playing and you're interacting with each other, people see that and people engage, and that's something that the roulette has definitely enabled me to do.
So where did the idea come from?
Well, it's funny because it's kind of how blues bars operate in the States and in Canada, and in parts of Europe, that there is a house band, and that house band is responsible for, a jam or two during the week. And then if there's a touring artist that's coming through, it's their job to have learnt the material so that the artist doesn't have to bring a band. So I kind of lifted that idea, and then I'd bought a business, and I was sort of working a lot, and I was really worried about going from playing music full time to going back into running a bricks and mortar business, that I would lose touch with what was going on in the blues community and the blues scene. So I found a bar that I thought was really cool, and a bar owner that I thought would understand what I was trying to achieve. And I sat him down and went, let's do this thing. And essentially it was kind of me conjuring up a way of staying relevant, keeping my hands busy, keeping my ear working, and providing gigs and creating work for musicians in Melbourne.
So going forward, we're almost into Christmas. What's happening with Blues Roulette and into 2020?
2020. So 2019 was a really big year for the roulette. I'm constantly blown away that that little idea has kind of bloomed into what it is. So we now do every Wednesday at the Catfish in Fitzroy. We now do every Sunday at Beneath Drivers Lane in the city. Both great, amazing, very American style bars, and it just really works with our aesthetic, which is important. I also do tours where I bring artists in to Victoria from interstate. We do a run of ticketed shows. I did my first one of those early 2019. Then mid-2019, I took a bunch of guys from Victoria into New South Wales and did a run of shows. Both those tours have had EPs recorded from them. I've released the first one. I haven't released the second one. I'm still mixing and mastering and stuff. So there's been 2 tours, 2 EPs recorded, 1 gig a week's turned into 2 gigs a week. We now have weekend runs of shows where an artist from interstate will call me and go, hey, I want to come to Melbourne this weekend, or that weekend, or whatever it is, and I'll book them Wednesday through Sunday. We can work out, all the money, and they know what they're going to get paid, and they can make a decision on whether they want to come or not. And so I found that the roulette has become a bit of a springboard for blues musicians to get a bit of a soft entry into Melbourne, because they don't have to bring a rhythm section, and they don't have to, and all of our social media can get behind them, so they're not turning up with no social media coverage and none of that stuff. So that's been really great. So all of that stuff will continue into 2020. I'm a little bit worried about kind of accidentally turning into a record label. It's not really what I want to do. It's not really where I want to spend my time. But when you start releasing material, I guess that's kind of the next thing. At the same time, I'm going to be spending a bit of time in the States next year in 2020, and I'm hoping that there's some way of getting me over there a little bit more, because as much as I love the scene and the industry here in Australia, it's small. We have a small community in Australia, which means there's less money circulating, which means, when you start talking about the arts and then a very small part of that arts, there's not a lot of money out there. So I really need to broaden the pool from which I can pay my rent.
Let's talk about your gear. Your main bass at the moment.
So, I, from day one, from that first bass, which was a P bass copy, I kind of went on a big journey, like all musicians do, looking at different gear and hows and whys and what works. And you know, I've played lots and lots of stuff, but I've always come back to a P bass, and for a long time it was Fenders. I played a lot of different Fender stuff. And then I had a late 70s P bass, and the neck kind of just died, which is what they were designed to do eventually. And I was talking to Dave Paul at the Guitar Hospital about trying to fix the neck, and you know, the surgery that was the open heart surgery that was going to happen to straighten the neck out, and I was a little bit worried about that. And we came up with the idea of him building me a bass, which we did, and I'm so happy that we did that. I'm so happy that that was the decision that was made, because it's everything I've ever wanted out of a P bass. It's super versatile. I've got a massive amount of dynamic range. It's light enough that I'm not killing myself playing 4 or 5 nights a week. It's great. I'm super happy.
And what are you playing through?
Mark bass stuff for the most part, you know. I got on Mark bass pretty early with the Little Mark II, the first sort of amp head that was made that was sort of this shape, or that chassis size. And I've been through a few different Mark bass stuff. I had a Momark for a little while, and one of the valve things that they did, and they're all great. I really dig it for a lot of reasons. But I think the biggest one now is that when I was building and we were going backwards and forwards about tone and really sculpting my bass, I was coming home and plugging into a Mark bass. So now that sound that we've shaped with my bass is half of that tone is now Mark bass. And I can, you know, you plug into anything and it works, but there's something about, you know, having really fine-tuned the instrument with that as a sounding board, that's now really important and really integral. And even when I'm touring and I'm playing on bigger stages with backline and stuff, I'll take a Mark bass head and unplug the valve amp that I've been given and plug the Mark bass in, because it just sounds right. Not that this is an advert for Mark bass, but you know, yeah, it's great gear.
Any regret basses, ones that got away?
The first US Fender that I ever bought was an Olympic white Elite P bass from '83, gold hardware, and there was, you know, big gold bridge and 2 sets of active P bass pickups, and this massive, great big broad neck. It was incredible, ridiculously heavy, but it was an incredible instrument. And I got into a spot, like we do as players, and had to sell it, and it sold. And a few years later, I was in a better spot, and I went back to that guy and said, "Hey, have you still got that bass?" Because he's like, "Oh, I sold it." And it's like, as soon as it's sold again, it's gone. You're never going to find it. So I do miss that instrument. I do miss, not so much because, I mean, tonally it maybe wasn't the most incredible thing, but it was my thing. It was my first real one, and I do regret letting that go. but gear.
When you look back at what you've done so far, what are your fondest memories?
Wow. I think, fondest memories. It's really funny because you don't look backwards like that very often as a player. You're kind of so what's happening tomorrow and what's happening next week and next month. I think watching the roulette kind of blossom into a platform for blues players to help each other is like something that's pretty mind-blowing for me. There's been a couple of records I worked on over the years that have done really well, and I think that in my 20s it was a really hard pill to swallow, because you haven't kind of learnt yet how the industry works, and you kind of still have this idea that I'm going to work on a record and then it's going to get sold, and that little piece of me that I've put on that record is going to pull me through into the industry, and it's going to show the community or the general population that I'm the guy that did that. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. There's a lot of stuff out there that I've played on and that you just don't ever see that kind of validation back from, and it was a really hard thing for me to deal with and a really hard thing for me to kind of live with, and at some point I worked out that that's actually okay, and that's the way it works, and it's not so much about getting outside validation, it's about getting the phone calls. And so I think for me, that learning moment, that moment where I worked out that what I do isn't for the mass population to pat me on the back. It's for the 100 guys in the Australian blues scene to go, wow, Ben really did a great job on that record. I don't know if that was maybe a little bit too existential of an answer, but yeah, I think that was a big one for me. Yeah, I don't know.
We've spoken about Blues Roulette. Any other projects coming in?
So under the Roulette banner, I do a lot of other stuff. We just recently did some Billy Bragg songbook shows with Jimmy Hocking, which was incredible. Mind-blowing that Jimmy managed to cram all of that information into his head. But yeah, so that was really cool. I think we're going to hopefully do a couple more of those in the new year. We've got I've got the next tour coming up in February, so I haven't signed all the contract stuff yet, but it's shaping up that we will have Fiona Boys, Nathan Beretta and Jesse Redwing down in Melbourne from New South Wales to do a couple of shows in mid-Feb. So I'm really excited about that. One of those, I'll record one of those shows, and hopefully that will become the third EP that the Roulette releases. And it's, just that next thing. I'm really excited about getting over to NAMM. I'm going to go over to the States in January for a few weeks, and I think it's my first official holiday where I have, well, it's not really a holiday, I'm over there doing NAMM, but I'm going to take a couple of weeks other side of NAMM, and it's the first downtime I'll have in, I think it's 6.5 years since I chose to put the phone down and stop. And I think I'm at a point that I need to stop for a couple of weeks. So I'm really looking forward to that. But that's more a me thing than a music thing, I guess. But it's, it's all one and the same now. My life is just music 24/7, and I'm loving it, but it's tough sometimes, Yeah. It's stressful, but it's fun. What do you do?
Ben Wicks, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'll see you soon. See you at NAMM.